Hi everyone, this is Allison. I wanted to pass along a little clarification about some of the content regarding energy and ecosystems from chapter 2 in our textbook. This picture here is of one of my favorite ecosystems. It's Panther Meadows up on Mount Shasta. So specifically, we're going to look at the following topics. We're going to look at energy, so what it is and how it behaves in general and in ecosystems. We're going to look at the movement of energy through an ecosystem, including making sure we have a good understanding of the basic inputs and outputs of photosynthesis and also cellular respiration. We'll also look at the process of consumption and how energy flows through an ecosystem through consumption. You can follow along or go back and look over these topics in your textbook. They're covered on pages 33 through 37. So, energy is an intangible phenomenon that can change the position, composition, or temperature of matter. So this would be like pushing something to cause it to move, changing the position. Energy can also change the composition of matter by causing chemical reactions to occur. It can change the temperature of matter, so it could cause matter to go from a solid form to a liquid form. So it's a pretty important force on Earth. There are a couple of laws of thermodynamics that describe the way energy operates on Earth. And the first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can be converted to other forms. So we're going to take a look at a couple of really important biological processes that are changing the forms of energy. This might be something like potential energy, like we see here. This man is standing on a platform high above the Earth's surface. So we would say that he's in an unstable position. He's in a high energy state. There's a lot of stored potential energy in his body. When he jumps off this platform, that stored energy is going to be converted to a different form of energy called kinetic energy, energy in motion. So the energy was not destroyed in that act of jumping. It merely changed forms from potential energy, which is a stored form of energy, to kinetic energy. Another example of energy changing forms that we're really familiar with would be a different kind of potential energy, chemical potential energy that's stored in gasoline. So this picture is a picture of a gasoline molecule. And when we burn gasoline in our internal combustion engines in our cars, it causes things to happen that cause the car to move. So once again, we're converting energy that's in gasoline, that's in these bonds between the atoms that build the molecule, to, in this case, energy in motion, kinetic energy, when we burn it inside the engine of our cars. So the first law of thermodynamics, again, just to repeat, tells us that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can be converted to other forms. And we've had a couple examples of that, including this one of burning gasoline in our cars. The second law of thermodynamics states that in an energy conversion, some usable energy is lost, usually to heat. So let's break that down a little bit. And let's go back to that example of burning gasoline inside the engines of our cars. So when we do that, there's a ton of energy in those bonds. Those were bonds between carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms in gasoline. There's a ton of energy there. And we capture some of that, actually not a lot of it, less than half of that, we capture and convert to kinetic energy. A lot of it is lost as heat. And you know this because when you have been driving your car for a while and then you put your hands on the hood, you feel that heat. So remember, the first law of thermodynamics told us that energy could not be created or destroyed. That energy still exists as heat, but it's not necessarily usable. So some usable energy is always lost to heat when we do these energy conversions, or it's lost to some other form. And it's lost in the sense that you can't really use it. So you certainly can't use that to make your car go. You can use it to warm your hands, but it's not going to allow you to get any more motion out of your car. The next point on this slide is that entropy or disorder is always increasing without inputs of energy. So that is kind of the other piece of the second law of thermodynamics. It's about increasing entropy. So whenever you have these energy conversions, like in the car, converting chemical potential energy from the hydrocarbons, from the gasoline, into kinetic energy, disorder is increasing. And what we mean by that is that the gasoline molecule is fairly orderly. So it's high energy and it's fairly orderly. It's a relatively large molecule. But after combustion, it gets converted to a bunch of other different molecules, a bunch of gases and particulates. Those get spewed out the tailpipe of the car. And so that's an example of this disorder that's always increasing without inputs of energy. We consider it more disorderly to have all of these small molecules that are separate from each other, lots of different things getting spewed into the atmosphere. The gasoline is considered to be more orderly. So entropy is always increasing without inputs of energy. That's the other piece of the second law of thermodynamics, which is really about energy conversions. Okay, so let's try to apply some of what we know about how energy operates to ecosystems. So on Earth, most of the energy is coming from the sun. And fortunately, some of Earth's inhabitants have adapted biochemical pathways that allow them to convert some of this energy coming from the sun, some of this solar energy, to chemical potential energy. And in this case, what I'm talking about are the autotrophs. So those are the organisms on Earth that can capture solar energy and convert it into chemical potential energy. So autotrophs include plants, those are the dominant autotrophs on land, and then also algae and cyanobacteria. And those are the dominant autotrophs that live in Earth's aquatic ecosystems. The biochemical pathway that these autotrophs are conducting in order to convert solar energy into chemical potential energy is called photosynthesis. And this is so important to Earth's ecosystems. In photosynthesis, the autotrophs are converting carbon dioxide and water, taking energy from the sun, solar energy, and they're making food in the form of carbohydrates like glucose, and they're releasing oxygen gas as a byproduct. This is a really ancient biochemical pathway, and in fact, it's responsible for producing the oxygen gas that we currently have in our atmosphere. That's so important for us to breathe, and it supports a lot of other organisms as well. So this biochemical pathway is nothing short of amazing, In it, we're converting inorganic carbon, carbon dioxide, that's a gas, to organic carbon, this glucose molecule, which feeds almost everything else on the planet. So photosynthesis fills the fridge, it fills the pantry, it fills the cupboards of all of the ecosystems, almost all of the ecosystems on planet Earth. In photosynthesis, we're starting with low energy molecules, carbon dioxide and water, pretty small, pretty low in energy. And because we're inputting solar energy, we're able to create something that's high in energy, this glucose molecule, which is so essential for feeding all of the other things that live in so many of our ecosystems. So photosynthesis produces more than 250 million metric tons of available carbon annually. So that's what fills the fridge, the pantry, and the cupboards of our planet. It's the main route in which energy enters the biosphere. So these autotrophs are taking an inorganic carbon source and they're making everybody's food out of it. Virtually all organisms on Earth are directly or indirectly dependent on this energy and on this matter. So this is the food that feeds almost everything else on the planet. It feeds the herbivores directly. They eat the algae, the cyanobacteria, and the plants. It feeds the carnivores indirectly because many of them are eating herbivores. So this is a really important component of ecosystems. Photosynthesis feeds the world. There's another important biochemical pathway that I want you to be familiar with that's called cellular respiration. And this is a really important energy conversion that occurs really commonly in the biosphere as well. So as I put here in this first bullet, cellular respiration is about getting the energy into the right form. Cellular respiration takes in oxygen and sugars, and it generates carbon dioxide, water, and something called ATP. So let's break this down a little bit. So cellular respiration is basically the breakdown of that food that we were just talking about that was generated by the autotrophs. So those are the sugars that are taken in. The oxygen that's taken in is in the atmosphere thanks to the autotrophs. So they really are feeding all of the other, or most of the other organisms in the biosphere. Cellular respiration generates carbon dioxide as a waste product. It generates some water as a waste product. This is the really important thing. It's called ATP. And ATP is what runs the cells of living organisms. So you need to eat food, but the carbohydrates and the fats and the proteins that are in the food don't feed your cells the energy that they need directly. You need to make an energy conversion. That energy conversion is cellular respiration. And the product of that conversion that is capable of motoring your cells is called ATP. So I like to think, the reason why I have this picture here is because I like to think about cellular respiration kind of like an energy conversion that's similar to the energy conversion that humans do in our power plants. So you have all this stuff in your house that runs off of electricity. None of it can you stick a little piece of coal into your computer, stick a little piece of coal into your cell phone. There's energy in that coal, but that's not the right form. First, the coal needs to go to a power plant and the energy needs to be converted to electricity, and then you can run all your stuff on it. It's kind of the same thing with aerobic respiration. We have to get the energy into the right form, or cellular respiration. We have to get the energy into the right form. ATP is what powers our cells. It's not going to be those sugars directly. So the next point I want to make is about heterotrophs and sort of the relationship between autotrophs and heterotrophs. So heterotrophs are organisms that get their energy from consuming other organisms, from eating other organisms. So you are a heterotroph. All animals are heterotrophs. Some bacteria are heterotrophic, and all fungi are heterotrophic. So these are organisms that need to consume other organisms. You need to have 3 meals a day and a bunch of snacks in order to make that ATP that you need to run your cells. So you're converting the food that you eat to ATP from that biochemical pathway that we just talked about, cellular respiration. This figure kind of nicely shows the relationship between heterotrophs and autotrophs, sort of on a ecosystem level. It shows autotrophs up here taking in carbon dioxide and water and making this food, these organic compounds, the sugars, the carbohydrates, and the other organic compounds. In the presence of oxygen, cellular respiration can break these down and fuel these heterotrophs. So they eat the organic compounds, then in the presence of oxygen, they can convert them to ATP, which they need to run their cells. Cellular respiration is going to generate water and carbon dioxide, which can then be used by the autotrophs. So this shows us the relationship between the autotrophs and the heterotrophs in ecosystems. The last point here I need to point out, because this is a common misconception, and I think I can see the source. This diagram kind of in some ways perpetuates that misconception. Almost all autotrophs conduct cellular respiration too. So even though plants are capable of making their own food, they don't have to go to the grocery store, but they still have to make ATP in order to get the energy into the right form. So many autotrophs conduct cellular respiration too. So that's a common misconception about ecosystems. Okay. So speaking of ecosystems, you should know that ecosystems include the organisms and the non-living entities that occur and interact in a particular area. So it's going to be the whole community of organisms, the plants, the animals, the fungi, the bacteria, the bugs, and also the non-living entities that occur and interact in a particular area. So the non-living entities would be things like energy, and that's what we're going to focus on the next slide. It could be things like nutrients, which you also learned a little bit about in chapter 2. On the next slide, though, we're going to focus on energy and how energy moves through ecosystems. Okay, so starting with this top bullet, we see that autotrophs, or in this diagram, they're being called primary producers, are the base of the food chain in ecosystems. They're the pantry, the refrigerator, the cupboards. They make the food. You read about a term called gross primary production, which I've abbreviated here as GPP. It's a number that represents the total amount of energy that's produced by autotrophs in an ecosystem. It's going to be really high in certain ecosystems where the growing conditions are prime for plants, things like tropical rainforests. It's going to be lower in ecosystems where the growing conditions are more challenging, like a desert. So net primary production is the energy that remains after cellular respiration. So gross primary production was the total energy produced by the autotrophs, but they need to use some of that. So they need to burn some of that up in cellular respiration to make their ATP. So net primary production is what's left over. It's the biomass. That energy is in the biomass of the bodies of the primary producers down here in the bottom of this pyramid. You learned about the term secondary productivity in your book. That's the biomass in the heterotrophs of the ecosystem. So that would include everything above the primary producers in this pyramid. So the primary consumers, the secondary consumers, the third level consumers, and the apex predators. I want to point out that this is not shaped like a pyramid randomly. This is actually what we tend to see in ecosystems. There's usually a lot more energy. So the pyramid's wide. There's a lot more energy in the primary producers. Only about 10% of that energy makes it one level up. Only about 10% of the energy in these primary consumers is going to make it up here to the secondary consumers. And that goes on all the way up the food chain, which is why this diagram is shaped like a pyramid. It's really important that you understand and can explain why only 10% of the energy is moving up in this ecosystem. We can see here that all the energy is coming from the sun. So the primary producers are going to lock it down. Remember, that's gross primary production. What's actually available is called net primary production. But check out the green arrows in this diagram. They're representing energy that's lost as heat. Remember the second law of thermodynamics. With every energy conversion, a little bit of energy is going to be lost as heat. So that's one reason why there's not a lot of energy making it up from the primary producers to the primary consumers. And so on and so on. This energy that's getting lost as heat, remember, this is entropy. It's not really useful anymore. So we should all be really thankful that we have a consistent supply of energy coming from the sun. So this energy can't get recycled. It just gets dissipated back out into the ecosystem. You can't harness it and reuse it. On the other hand, this last point tells us that while energy flows through an ecosystem, nutrients cycle. And nutrient cycles are covered in a different part of this module, but you can see them represented here by these orange arrows. This is showing nutrients, stuff like carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus that's in these primary producers getting moved to this decomposer food chain. So all of the nutrients at all levels of this ecosystem are going to eventually, when these organisms die, be processed by decomposers. And those decomposers return the nutrients back to the soil where they can be taken up again by primary producers. So this is what I mean by nutrient cycling in an ecosystem while the energy flows. It comes from the sun. It gets temporarily locked down in the primary productivity of the ecosystem. But with every level, some is getting lost to heat and used in cellular respiration, and it's not usable anymore. It can't be recycled. So in closing, you should know what energy is, the definition of energy, and also how it operates according to the first and second law of thermodynamics. You should know the role of autotrophs in an ecosystem. You should understand that photosynthesis is the biochemical pathway that feeds an ecosystem. You should understand how energy in food is converted to a usable form, the basic inputs and outputs of cellular respiration. And then finally, you should understand how energy flows through an ecosystem. Thanks for listening.